take your seats, that would be great. I gave a longer introduction earlier before the first panel, so I'm not going to repeat that now, but let me just take a moment to say welcome. This is the second panel of the day for this COMPAS conference. COMPAS is a program called Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, where we try to bring people together from different disciplines and the community to talk about really important major issues, and we're talking about inequality all year in this series of events. This is our spring conference. Let me just mention two other upcoming events. On April 3rd at 1 o'clock, there's an event on unconditional basic income with a philosopher from Stanford University at 1 p.m. And that will be in the Thompson Library down in 165. And then on April 11th, we have Joyce coming to give a distinguished lecture in ethics. And that will be in the Sean Auditorium at 4 p.m. And if you Google it, you'll quickly find it. We do ask if people are some fees to that. That should be if you haven't heard of it, you'll avoid it, to be honest. Okay, so having made those announcements, let me now just introduce to you Joyce Chen, who is a professor in the Department of, I should have checked this. AEDE is how I would refer to it, which is Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. Here, and here's her name tag. And Joyce will be the moderator for this panel, and I'll let her introduce the speakers. Thank you.
I actually will, I'm going to invite our speakers to introduce themselves. So Ines and Valdez from the Political Science Department here in the state. Yeah, or do you want to?
Hello everyone, I'm Ines Valdez. I'm the Political Science Department at University. My work is mainly on two topics, the politics of the theory of migration as well as the political theory of cosmopolitanism and global justice.
I'm Adam Hosein. I'm from the University of Colorado in Boulder and work on immigration, which we're going to talk about today, and discrimination, which I'm also going to talk about today, and some stuff about democracy and speech.
Okay, so we're just going to have our panelists here spend a few minutes talking about some key issues related to immigration, migration, and ethics, and then open up to some questions. Some questions for me.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming. It's great to be here. This is the first effective years of long-term education, and as well as Eric, Michael, and Christmas for making this conversation possible. As I started to think about migration in relation to the question of inequality, I thought there were at least three ways in which migration could be connected to law or organized inequality. In the first place, migration law results from inequality in the sense that individuals escape dire economic conditions and move in the hope of finding economic opportunities. In this sense, poverty often associated with income differentials within and across countries, among other factors, drive migration. A second sense in which these two are connected is that migrant populations in most countries often come to occupy an unequal position in the whole society. Particularly when their status is irregular, migrants face poor labor conditions, receive lower wages, vis-a-vis workers, and face other obstacles having to do with language, culture, access to networks, and discrimination. Are things that put them in a position of inequality. The third way in which they are connected is very similar research dealing with the question of global inequality and domestic inequality. Is the way in which immigration relates to the way in which mass migration has historically as well as recently become intimately connected to the way in which domestic inequality is managed. And by managed, I mean not dealt with, but is about in ways that centrally relate to race, migration, and alternative facts. Thus, in my presentation, I will concentrate on the third point, the way in which a certain understanding or construction of the question of immigration has become a central symbolic tool for articulating current grievances of citizens. According to this interpretation, I would argue that the system of immigration enforcement can be better understood as a system of coercion that both reinforces exploitative labor conditions and carries life from migrants and satisfies certain rights of punishment among citizens. In closing, I will trace some parallels between the way the question of immigration has been framed in the last 2 decades and the broader rhetoric of alternative facts that is relevant today and briefly discuss its effects. I would like to start in 1994, when California placed Proposition 187 on the ballot. This proposition that established a state-run citizenship screening system and prohibited undocumented migrants from using non-emergency health care provides a good snapshot of the immigrant rhetoric that would fuel the passage of 2 federal immigration bills 2 years later that would radically increase immigration detention, expand the grounds of deportation, including deportation of legal federal investment, and cement the notion of quote-unquote criminal aliens, which still dominates immigration enforcement today. The official name of this ballot initiative was quote-unquote Save Our State. The state needed to be saved from undocumented migrants, it was understood, setting the stage for discussion of immigration in terms of victims, law-abiding, tax-paying citizens, victimized by law-breaking undocumented migrants. I want to focus for a minute on the paradoxical nature of this claim. As I suggested at the outset, undocumented migrants are among the most vulnerable members of our communities. Yet this discourse gives them inordinate power to threaten our way of life, steal our jobs, and stretch thin public service. I would now want to address statistics regarding the lower rate of criminality among immigrant communities, or the multiplicative viral additive effect that immigrants' jobs have on the economy, or focus on the amount of taxes that immigrants pay, including Social Security taxes that they will never collect, which have lessened the deficit of these accounts substantially in the United States. This is in fact what immigrant activists do. They collect these facts in order to oppose anti-immigrant narratives. But this is an important task I want to pursue in this talk. Instead, I want to focus on what the enforcement practices and anti-immigrant narratives are doing. In other words, I want to distinguish between what the narratives say, that is, claims that do not often stand up to scrutiny, and what the narratives do, which is to construct, with arguably some success, a criminal alien where there was none. In my research, I will construct a particular way in which narratives and practices of enforcement, that is, the symbolic and the material, contribute to construct a particular immigrant figure that is then cited as the threat that must be combated, the source of our victimization as citizens. The expansion of surveillance, detention, and deportation become not only palatable, but a fitting punishment for the imagined harms they brought to our society. It is only through this construction that we can understand the deportation It is only through this construction that we can understand the deportation of millions of immigrants in the last decade. This figure considers exclusively immigrants that were removed from the interior, that is, it excludes deportations of prison border crossers and counts only migrants removed from our communities, that is, intercepted by local law enforcement or immigration and customs enforcement, detained, and eventually deported back to their countries, usually in commercial or charter flights managed by immigration and customs enforcement air operations that lead from localities around the country towards, including Central Ohio, towards destination toward life. But the narrative of victimization of white American citizens or criminalization of brown migrants was evident in our current president's campaign message and has been confirmed by the action of his administration so far. The narrative is more widespread. The Obama administration continually relied upon the narrative of criminalization, arguing that the focus of enforcement was criminal aliens, despite the fact that his administration never ceased deporting immigrants without criminal background, which made up between 40 and 70% of the population in his administration. There is also the fact that quote-unquote criminal aliens are loosely defined, and increasingly so now after Trump's two executive orders on immigration, to include crimes that were fact traffic violations or tautologically immigration violations. Obama declared publicly that his goal in ramping up deportations was to bring Republicans to the negotiating table in order to pass immigration reform. If they could show that they were tough and were willing to enforce the laws to pass, Republicans would agree to a reform with a path to legal status. This did not happen. This is not only tragic for the record number of deported individuals that were part of this bargaining deal, but was also a fundamental misunderstanding of the logic of immigration enforcement. Immigration enforcement is devoted to create a threatening individual whose punishment fulfills an important function in the economy of affect of a significant subgroup of voters. The lack of access to legal status by undocumented migrants is a crucial requirement of the vulnerability and punishment of the undocumented population. And by this I refer not only to detention and deportation, which have been studied by lawyers in the literature on pre-immigration, but also the actual living conditions of immigrants without documents currently, which I also find primitive in my research. While this dynamic has become clearer with the advent of the populist right in the West, it has characterized the system of immigration enforcement for much longer. In fact, it is the performative character of immigration enforcement, the effort to produce a criminal immigrant through symbolic and material actions in order to close the gap between claims of criminality and reality that most closely resembles the world of alternative facts in which we live today. It is important to note that taken together, all the alternative facts we've learned in the long campaign in the last 60 days plus put forward a consistent image of an America under threat, victimized by external enemies, including China, Muslims, Mexicans, other NATO members, etc. In addition to the important task of fact-checking, it is this consistency and its currency that needs to be critically assessed for a democratic republic to be recovered. After the democratic critique of these practices, the symbolic and material actions associated with immigration enforcement heightens domestic inequality because fear of surveillance by local law enforcement, as well as federal immigration enforcement, results in deteriorating working conditions, decreased mobility, decreased access to social services for which many migrants qualify, and economic and emotional hardships for the families of deportees. Democratic access by communities. Sorry, I was late. Democratic access by communities of color also suffers from this scheme, because increased surveillance of their communities, as well as the narrowing of quote-unquote American identity that results from the particular narratives of belonging and deservingness, further exclude them. To conclude then, I would like to suggest that a democratic public should be able to recognize the drastic transformation and growing inequality that takes place domestically, and the understandable anxiety that comes with it, without displacing the actual culprits. In other words, a democratic public should be able to address its anxieties along discussions about deindustrialization, welfare state retrenchment, and the devastating effects, for some at least, of transnational capitalism that have already been discussed in this forum to some extent, and the economic and political actors who drove these processes, rather than soothe them by redirecting them and fixating them in foreign threat, including immigration. Thank you.
Microphone. You guys hear me for that? Okay. Oh. Okay, so immigration policy is often said to be a distinctive area where the people regulated have very limited or no rights, and the government, especially the executive, has extremely broad discretion. Lawyers like to call this view immigration exceptionalism. And what I want to do today is try to provide a little context for thinking about that, issue of whether immigration policy should be viewed as distinctive, whether immigrants really do have very few rights against the government, whether the executive really should have extremely broad discretion, by thinking about immigration policy in light of a much broader moral question, which is, what rights, if any, do people who are considered outsiders to the political community have? And I'll focus on the United States. People who are considered outsiders relative to the political community of the United States. And as a case study, and I'm going to talk about the revised travel ban issued by President Trump. Partly because it raises some interesting theoretical questions, but also because I think it matters. So, just to remind you a little bit about the travel ban, what it did, or what it was supposed to do, was to limit the ability of people from 6 Muslim majority countries to enter the United States. And was temporarily restrained by Judge Watson in Hawaii, and more recently subject to further restraint by the same judge. But the United States government appealed the judgment yesterday, and so we'll see what happens in the courts. What I want to ask is not the legal question of whether the ban is constitutional or should be deemed constitutional, or will be deemed constitutional, but the moral question of whether immigrants should have constitutional rights, or any rights, including rights against arbitrary or discriminatory treatment. Now, what the ban raises is this fundamental moral question that I think has recurred throughout the history of the United States, which is one of what rights, if any, do outsiders or people considered outsiders have? And outsider status has been associated with at least 3 different groups. So first up, we've got people who lack citizenship or permanent residency or some kind of other formal legal status in the United States. The first version, Trump ban 1.0, included permanent residents and other people who had some kind of legal status in the United States, but the revised order overall focus just on people who do not have such status. So that's one kind of outsider, someone who isn't a citizen nor a permanent resident. Another kind of outsider, or a person thought of as an outsider in United States history, people who are viewed as outside of the bounds of the nation, or the majority's conception of itself as a nation. And of course, conceptions of the nation vary over time. Sometimes they were racial, sometimes they've been more ethnic in a broader sense, sometimes they've been more cultural or political. So outsiders here is people who are outside of the ethnic cultural nation. And then thirdly, there are people who are outsiders or considered outsiders by virtue of their sheer territorial location, by virtue of being outside of the territorial boundaries of the United States. And here too, there's been some variation over time in terms of who's been considered an outsider, who hasn't. So an obvious example being the treatment of people of Puerto Rico, outsiders or insiders relative to the territorial boundaries of the United States. The targets of the revised order are outsiders in all of these senses. They're non-citizens, as I said about, at least when we're thinking about travel ban 2.0, more permanent residents, more people with any other pre-existing legal entitlements to be in the United States. They're considered by many in the United States to be outside of the national community, whether because of their race, national origin, religion, culture, and they live outside of the territorial borders of the United States, seeking to gain entry. They live in Iran, or Libya, Syria, or whatever. Do these folks have rights against the United States government, including rights against arbitrary treatment and discrimination in immigration policy? Well, defenders of the ban say no, and they say that, moreover, the insiders have the right to advance their interest as a group, however they see fit. To assert the rights of outsiders, including these rights against arbitrary and discriminatory treatment, is to put unacceptable limits on the sovereign nation of the United States to act on the sovereign nation to act on behalf of its people. So what could be said, if anything, to counter this line of thought, to assert the rights of fugitive outsiders? Well, at the most abstract, one thing we can emphasize are the core self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, that all people, regardless of citizenship, ethnicity, religion, or location, are born equal with an entitlement to liberty. And I'm hopeful that at least that much can still gain some consensus, at least pitched at that level of abstraction, that all individuals, simply as people, are born free and equal. Well, what exactly do those abstractions demand in policy terms? And do they put real limits on the ability of the government to act, especially in the arena of immigration and its treatment of outsiders? So let's try to get down to some of those practicalities. What limits do these abstract requirements of respect and freedom and equality really demand? So first of all, think about people who are denied rights because they are viewed as outsiders in the first sense that I talked about. People considered outsiders because they lack formal status of citizenship. Well, in my audience, you might first think of immigrants as being people who lack formal citizenship. But of course, the United States history reminds us of other important examples, especially of African Americans and Native Americans who were often deemed non-citizens. Supreme Court's 1857 Dred Scott decision ruled that people of African descent could not be citizens of the United States within the meaning of the Constitution, and therefore did not qualify for the protections afforded to U.S. citizens within the Constitution. So, slavery was rendered consistent with the Constitution, at least for a time. The Reconstruction Amendments are a direct repudiation of the Dred Scott decision in this way of thinking. This thought that certain people could be denied constitutional rights simply by being deemed non-citizens. So, for example, the 14th Amendment dictates that no state shall, quote, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. With my no person, not no citizen. The Reconstruction Amendments say that the clauses, the Reconstruction Amendments put limits on the treatment of how any person within the jurisdiction of the state can be treated, not just how any citizen can be treated. They say that there are limits on how anyone can be treated by the government when it exercises power over them, and they recognize that these exercises of power must be constrained whether or not that person is a citizen. We also have clear historical examples of people being denied rights on grounds of their ethnicity, on grounds of their being viewed as outsiders in the second sense that I talked about, viewed as being outside of the ethnocultural nation. Now, for example, that would be the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Supreme Court Korematsu accepted the government's argument that the internment was necessary as potential disloyalty on the part of Japanese Americans who were deemed to be separate from the national community, even though 70,000 of the 120,000 people sent to camps were U.S. citizens. But the Supreme Court has never subsequently referred to Korematsu with approval. There's no disloyalty among Japanese Americans to match the government's claims, and certainly not enough we now recognize to validate heavy restrictions on that freedom. President Reagan approved damages for those affected. President Clinton awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Frank Korematsu, the plaintiff of the case. So here too, we can see a conclusion that the exercise of government power over people is morally constrained, even where those folks are deemed outsiders, in this case outsiders in the sense of being people beyond the national community, the ethnocultural national community. So when we recognize these moral facts about the history of the United States, and we recognize the moral progress of the Reconstruction Amendments and the moral failings of Japanese American internment, we're pointing towards a broad principle which is familiar in the social contract tradition and philosophy. The principle that says that when the government exercises power over someone, it takes control of their life to some degree, urging their freedom, and it thus must have a good justification for doing so, even where those controlled are considered civic or national outsiders. The more significant the exercise of control, the more significant the justification required. And this line of reasoning suggests that people who are deemed outsiders in our third sense, people who live outside the territorial boundaries of the United States, can also claim rights against the government. They too can demand justification when the government exercises power over them, even though they may be considered outsiders. So take, for instance, detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Detention, especially indefinite detention, is clearly an exercise of power over them. In fact, a very substantial exercise of power and control over them, and therefore requires a strong justification. And the Supreme Court majority, again, v. Bush, and several other subsequent cases pointed out as much, recognizing that, quote, freedom from unlawful restraint as a fundamental preset of liberty, even where it occurs outside of the territorial boundaries of the United States, in this case in Guantanamo Bay. And the court concluded that, quote, even where the United States acts outside its borders, its powers are not absolute and unlimited, but are subject to such restrictions as are expressed in the Constitution. So we can apply the legal sentiments that was expressed in that ruling to the case of immigration. We can apply this broad principle that exercises of power require justification wherever they take place to the case of immigration. And if you saw what happened in January 27th when the first immigration order came into effect, you know that immigration restrictions involve an exercise of power. You know that people who were trying to get from Cairo to New York were forcibly escorted away from their flights. You know that people who arrived in Valdez or JFK were detained on arrival. Those are exercises of power, governmental power and control. As the influential immigration theorist Joe Cairns put it, quote, borders have guards and the guards have guns. You might have added too that they also have detention rooms and the detention rooms have locks. Now, I don't want to oversell this point. Preventing someone from entering the country is not an overwhelming exercise of control of them on the order of detaining them indefinitely. At least assuming that they don't get detained indefinitely, or something you can't always assume in the modern world, but assuming that the detention at the borders is temporary. Nor is someone who is prevented from entering the United States made the subject of the United States government in the way that someone who actually lives in the country is. So the immigrant is told, do as you will, but you're not allowed to do it here, whereas someone within the country who's within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States has to follow a much broader set of rules about how to live their life made by the United States government. But all the same, exclusion from the territory is an exercise of power, and in light of that principle that I mentioned earlier, it requires some justification. And in the case of Trump's travel ban, it seems that the government lacks even the most minimal justification. Despite the administration's claims to be protecting American lives, the New American Foundation found that every killing on U.S. soil by a jihadist terrorist since 9/11 was perpetrated by an American citizen, a permanent resident, and in no case by someone with ties to one of the countries singled out by Trump's executive order. A couple of documents leaked from the Department of Homeland Security likewise found no basis in national security for restricting the travel of people from the 6 targeted countries. So far, I've talked about some ways in which respecting the freedom of people, of all people, one of the 2 core directives of the Declaration, can constrain the treatment of individuals who are deemed to be outsiders. What about respect for their equality, for their moral equality of persons? And here, too, I think the past can help guide us. So the moral and legal history of the United States suggests that not only do exercises of government power require justification, but also that laws that have certain kinds of motivation behind them are categorically ruled out. Laws based, for example, on racial prejudice, unfounded stereotypes about what women are capable of, or irrational discomfort with the presence of mentally ill people have all been found morally and legally unacceptable. What do those laws have in common? What they have in common is that they fail to appreciate the moral equality of the people in developing groups. They fail to recognize that members of other races and genders are not lower entities to be aided, and that the mentally ill are fit to live alongside everybody else. What makes those laws, these inegalitarian motivations, morally problematic? And I think there are 2 plausible and complementary approaches. One says that it's just inherently oppressive for the government to exercise power over a group of people on grounds that can't be squared with understanding members of that group as equals. That's one moral problem. The second moral problem is what laws of that kind express. So if you take, for instance, segregation, which was premised on the unworthiness of black students to be educated alongside white students, the central problem with it is what it expressed to those black students, that the fact that it, as the Brown decision put it, it created, quote, a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way likely never to be undone. Trump's executive order has also created a categorically unacceptable base, also has a categorically unacceptable motivation, grounded as it is in irrationally broad fear of Muslims. Do I still have a couple minutes? Trump, of course, lied to his criticism, so are his defenders, and so they don't refer to it as a Muslim ban anymore. They say, look, it just targets people based on their country of origin, and they say, look, immigration laws always make distinctions based on nationality. Also, they say, look, can't the president change his mind? Maybe previously he was worried about Muslims, but now he's gotten into office and he's figured out that the real risks are associated with particular regions and not with particular religions. Those arguments are not convincing. We've been here before. Japanese American concentration camps were also purported to serve security interests, but those unfounded claims covered for the real basis for the law to satisfy the rage of white people on the West Coast in the wake of Pearl Harbor and thereby shore up political support for President Roosevelt. The new executive order has a similarly weak official purpose of protecting national security, and has an equally plain function of appeasing elements of Trump's base who equate being from the Islamic world with being essentially inclined towards acts of terrorism. A law of this kind is apparently oppressive, even where its targets are overseas. It involves an exercise of power on grounds that can't be squared with their equality as people, and it's also problematic because of its message. The United States is heavily involved with the government and people of the Islamic world. It frequently asks for their cooperation on intelligence. It's frequently asked for the right to fly and activate deadly drones in their airspace. It's asked for access to their natural resources and so on. Now, some people say, well, the problem with Trump's ban is that it's going to be counterproductive. It's going to sap the willingness of people in the Islamic world to cooperate by alienating them. But what I want to say is that whether or not it's counterproductive, and I think it probably is, there's also a more basic moral problem with treating people in this way. If the United States is to exercise power in the Islamic world and make demands of its members, then it has to do so on the basis of some minimal respect and equality of footing. And the message of the travel ban is still that people from the Islamic world are inherently suspect, unfit to even be considered for entry to the United States. But those folks still have to deal with the United States. They still have to interact with the United States and its power and its demands. And just as it's repugnant in the domestic case to create a sense of inferiority amongst a whole class of people, to create a sense of racial caste, it's also morally repugnant to create in the global case a sense of there being two orders of people, of superiors and inferiors. So to return to the question that I asked at the beginning, should immigration law be viewed as exceptional? Should it be an area where executive discretion ought to be free from ordinary constitutional constraints? I think the answer is a modest no. There are serious constraints on immigration, moral constraints on immigration law. The arguments for limited discretion vary, but they all share some basic vision that immigrants are outsiders, whether civic, national, geographical, or all the above, and therefore lack rights against the government. But that vision can't be sustained. Wherever they come from, immigrants are still people, born free and equal. That means that they do have rights, including rights against arbitrary treatment and discrimination. And those rights remain violated by the revised executive order.
Alright, so before we start with questions, I just want to mention quickly, as an economist, I think the economic analysis on immigration to the U.S. is actually fairly clear, and I think the profession certainly has reached a consensus that on the whole, immigration is beneficial for economic growth, and there's very little evidence that on average immigration has almost no impact on, essentially no impact on wages, and essentially no impact on employment levels of native-born people in the U.S. Where there are impacts, they tend to be concentrated among the lowest skill in the U.S. So what I raise this because I think it's very clear that this sets up the question of immigration into the U.S. As really a question of ethics and human values. There's very little justification in terms of economic protectionism for immigration restrictions. And if the U.S. were so inclined to look at efforts to reduce global inequality, relaxing immigration restrictions is almost certainly the policy that would have the largest impact, hands down, without question, compared to any development policy that's ever been attempted and that we could ever hope for in terms of success. Then there's the question of balancing global inequality versus domestic inequality, because there is a potential for immigration to reduce global inequality while increasing domestic inequality. And I think this leads us to the question that's essentially at the heart of all of this, which is how we value, is America first a morally legitimate, and ethically legitimate stance to take, and sort of what would be the boundaries of this claim for America first.
Thanks a lot. I, of course, agree with all I'm an expert, but I agree with all the economic points that you made. On the question of the relation between domestic and global inequality, I think here too, the question is whether we should view the ways in which immigration can potentially exacerbate domestic inequality, or we should think that as a kind of distinctive problem of immigration policy or just a more general problem. And so the question is whether, when we're asking, well, what are the effects of immigration on domestic inequality, are we holding fixed everything else about policy in the United States? Or are we considering, well, what will the effects of immigration be on domestic inequality if we also are taking aggressive steps generally to try to end inequality? So there's some tie-in with Professor Hacker's talk yesterday about this more general issue of inequality. And so I think it's a mistake to view immigration policy kind of in isolation to this more general issue of how to deal with inequality. And so that might take some of the heat off the immigration issue itself.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that. The fact that some studies, not all of them, find that there's a negative impact on the wages of low-skilled American workers from immigration. Again, doesn't mean that there's only two things happening in the world. There's migrants coming in and low-skilled workers getting low wages. And there's a host of issues that both are the root of immigration and they are the root of domestic inequality. And I think that's why I mentioned thinking about questions like the effects of trade opening from capitalism, etc. So are those lower wages and minimum wage, all things being equal, and it's always calculated, but there's much more money going to the 1% that Aaron mentioned, Jacob stuff that was very clear. There's more money going to the 1% than money going to the immigrants coming to perform those jobs. So I think that and that's why I wanted to kind of move away from the economic discussion and ask, well, if it's not about economics, what is it about? What is it that migrants are doing for us? And perhaps for us, not so much, but for the rise of populism, in the sense that they become a way of not talking about this broader trends in inequality and the fact that it is not migrants getting those transfers, massive transfers of income, but rather financial institutions, financial corporations, as well as high-tech corporations that are able to offshore their production, etc., etc., etc.
So this touches on other issues that both of you raised related to national identity. And so you're struck by this question of how is it just a separation within the country of people who perceive in the way that we perceive national identity in the U.S., or is there, what is the sort of moral, ethical foundation we should bring to thoughts of national identity and how it should evolve over time?
Thanks for that question. So we know that national identities are imagined, are constructed, and so I think that a useful way to approach that question would be to think about how, first, how immigration contributes to a particular form of national identity and how that national identity excludes certain historical facts from what our nation has done and how we've gotten here. So to give an example, we can think about just to remain on immigration, given that Central Americans and Mexicans constitute the big majority immigrants, and even a bigger majority of those detained and deported. We will think about the history of the United States vis-a-vis Mexico and vis-a-vis Central America. Just to focus on Mexico, we could think about conquest as a crucial kind of linkage between these two countries, and then an effort to ignore the fact that the Southwest is formerly native land, then a formerly Spanish colonial area, Spanish-speaking territory and population absorbed by the United States. And so the fact that when these states were absorbed, and when the country was considering even absorbing more of Mexico, one crucial discussion was, well, I mean, do we want as many brown people? And these were explicitly about race. And this is also the way in which gradual population transfers of white citizens gave way to the incorporation because they were no longer majority non-white. And so, if we think about national identity and we think about it as constructed, the only way to understand the Roman understanding of American identity is to understand it by its forgetfulness, by the COMPAS, by the incorporation that was forceful, and by then the forgetting that is part of the English only is a perfect example, right? Of course, I mean, only very few countries would think speaking only one language is a good thing, but also, I mean, the fact that English only ignores that half of the country whose ancestors spoke Spanish. So that's very much a process of construction.
Do you think that if there's a portion of the population, I don't know how large, that's expressing a preference for putting certain limits on our national identity, does our government then have a role in enacting that or making that a reality?
Well, I think that if there is a democratic discussion about whether a national identity should look like, and I mean, of course, it's kind of awkward to think about government enacting a national identity, and of course they do, I mean, through rituals and through the dates, the historical moments that we choose to remember, but I mean, I don't see why national identity and particular ways of remembering our past shouldn't be the subject of democratic discussion. And I think that increasingly, I don't know increasingly, but to some extent, these discussions that involve questions of reparations, questions of recognition of COMPAS and civil rights violations as well vis-a-vis the Mexican American population, particularly from Texas. So I'm all for having a democratic discussion about national identity. I think that would assume that we need to open up what American history is much more than what we open up today.
I agree with everything you said. I think we have to be kind of proactive in thinking about how we shape national identity, and the question is, well, what would a kind of a good national identity look like? So we know the peril. The peril is that we define national identity narrowly in a way that some people who are citizens are still considered outside of the bounds of the nation because of their race or ethnicity or whatever it may be. And so political philosophers have often said, well, the solution is to have a kind of civic national identity where you focus on certain documents that embody just political ideals. And you say, well, look, we can all agree that the Constitution is great, even if that's what it is to be an American, is to believe in the Constitution or to believe in the Declaration of Independence. And I think there's something to that line, but that too has, I think, some perils. So, the kind of focus on the Constitution, for instance, as a basis for national identity in this country is often led to a kind of founder worship that ultimately leads back to treating white male people as the privileged core of the nation. So I think that it is good to try to think of the nation in terms of a set of civic ideals that everyone can agree to, but I think it's also important to make sure that we be clear that the people involved in exposing what the real ideas are were not just folks who wrote the Declaration, but also people like Fred Korematsu, for instance, who helped us to notice that what it really takes to enact those ideals practically. So, so it's just like you have this parallel of a certain kind of founder worship that I think can be described.
And just to follow up on that, I think that there are also questions with this identification with just civic ideals. But there is no reason that one needs to identify with history in terms of only glorifying history. You can, and this is why the Carmazzo example is great. You can identify with history by, regretting that history and repairing that history. And so there is no reason why forms of identification need to be only glorifying, and we cannot think about the past of slavery, the past of the Chinese ban, the Japanese internment, as well as the current anti-Muslim rhetoric, in ways that our identity is to be able to overcome those things rather than identify with them.
Yeah, and I think the concern on the other side is, even if we were able to kind of remove the racial aspects of our immigration discussion in this country, there's always this feeling of the more you create sort of fuzziness around borders, whatever they are, right? National origin, national identity, the harder it is to define it, right? So we all have our own families, right? I have a family that lives in my house, and I don't take in everybody off the street who looks like they need help because I have some sense of what that family is, and I can't allow that definition to be too fuzzy for various reasons that may or may not be justifiable. And so I think on the other side, that my perception of what the resistance to immigration comes from is this feeling that this loss of national identity, right? That the sense that we can't redefine it without losing it.
To some extent, I think part of the strategy there is to try to change the politics of immigration so that it's not like every single debate about immigration policy is a referendum on the fundamental structure of the nation. It's like, oh, we're going to issue a few more H-1B visas. Let's just talk about the practicalities of that and try to get away from thinking that it's inevitably this really fraught, because it doesn't need to be. Just you're hiring some folks to be nurses or whatever they do.
It really changes the, very interesting to go to, you go to Ireland, and in Ireland, immigrants, they only have, immigrants only that are white, so they have 5 million immigrants. They talk about their immigrant population. I was going there visiting these union homes that were talking about the immigrants, and I was trying to figure out who are the immigrants. And of course, some immigrants that visually didn't work, know when they started talking to the immigrants. And I started asking these, there were some political leaders in the meeting, and I said, why do you do that? And they said, well, many of us had gone to live in the US, back in Ireland. We knew, we experienced all this racial tension and whatever. So we thought this would deal with the issue. And we found there could be much less tension by us. We're accepting Muslim immigrants, we're accepting immigrants from Eastern Europe, and we haven't had the same tension we're having in the rest of the world. And I thought it was such I don't think they were being honest with themselves at all. They weren't dealing with the fact that it was their own racism. But this was their way of handling the issue. It'd be interesting to study, actually what happened there in terms of how the immigrants were treated. But the country, the country making a decision that they were let in as many Muslim immigrants as they wanted, and they would only accept them once they were allowed. And interesting to see a comparative analysis of the tensions in the fascinating comparison where they separated it by race.
Just to say that, thinking from the perspective of democratic theory, you can think about democracy as consensus, or you can think about democracy as getting out of your comfort zone and dealing with difficult questions. And it seems that from what you described in the Irish case, there might be a problem of racism in this country, so we just don't want to deal with it, so we'll just stick with immigrants. But that is not something that would be defensible from a perspective that,
Absolutely not.
even from the very Irish democratic perspective, right? And that's why I think that thinking about immigration is extremely useful to think about democracy. So it is not that we think about democracy and then we derive principles as to what we owe to immigrants, but these days, there's no immigrant going on board. Every single Western society is an immigrant society, one way or the other. And I think what is fascinating to me about immigration is how much you learn about the democratic character of people by the way in which they deal with democracy. And that seems really close to avoid problems such as possible.
Yes, just to say 2 words about Ireland. There's certainly a long history of racism in Ireland, but I think there's a serious debate going on there now about national identity and how to construct it in ways that are more complicated. There are certainly a much larger proportion of, say, Nigerian immigrants in Dublin now than there were 10, 20, certainly obviously 50 years ago. And there is some effort to tweak national identity. There's a statue of Phil Lynott, the black lead singer of Thin Lizzy, on O'Connell Street, I think. So there's an attempt to find national heroes who aren't really white, and that's sort of part of what I was saying earlier about this attempt to engineer a national identity that's a little more inclusive. And so it's interesting to see different experiments in that in different places.
Thank you both for your interesting presentations. I guess your discussion has already sort of turned in this direction, but my first question was, why do you think the U.S. has forgotten its, you mentioned in some ways that it's forgotten its past as a past conquest and so on, but I wonder why it seems to have forgotten its past as an immigrant society. There were people here when the first Europeans came, but for the last 400 years it's been an immigrant society. It seems like every wave of immigration, people who are already here forget that they were immigrants too, or their parents were immigrants too, or their parents. And so why do you think the U.S. has forgotten that piece of its identity, Statue of Liberty, as for and what do you think are the prospects for rebuilding the U.S. identity as multicultural? And then, if I don't want to take too much time, but just a second question for Adam. You suggested that the power at the border, for it to not be arbitrary, it owes the person over whom it exercises power justification. And I wondered how exactly you were thinking of that. Were you thinking of that as procedural, so it would be enough that there be due process of some kind at the border for that exercise of power to be justified, or are you really thinking in terms of what are the precise reasons that power is being exercised? But those are just 2 thoughts I have, but I don't want to monopolize them.
Thank you. Right. First I would kind of redefine the U.S. not necessarily as an immigrant society. I would define it initially as an instance of settler colonialism, and then after its independence, you could I guess, I mean, to return to some extent to what Catherine was discussing. So I would define it first as an instance of settler colonialism, and then after its independence as not completely separated from an imperial trajectory. So that would be the first one. And then, I mean, I can actually go to my other topic of research, which is W.E.B. Du Bois. There's very interesting, I mean, he writes really interesting essays around the time that the Chinese ban was passed, the Asian ban of 1924. And so this is the moment in which the first, I mean not first, but one very strong nativist reaction to immigration, where for the first time there's a visa system and full abroad immigration regulation established. And so then what you have is kind of this past, this past of settler colonialism and then an independence without kind of a break with an imperial trajectory necessarily. And then you have the question of what Du Bois called Americanization. And so in this essay, in 1920, I believe exactly, what he's arguing for, he's kind of speaking to Southern European immigrants. All the immigrants that, according to the racial classification that was part of the 1924 law, were inferior to Anglo-Saxons, and that included all non-Northern Europeans. And what he says is, do not identify with whiteness, like identify with, those who are similar to you because they are workers, those that are similar to you because they are discriminated against. And so there was, there were many junctures in which we could have gone, or new immigrants could have gone one way or the other. They could have chosen to identify with workers, or enter interracial alliances, or they could have chosen to go with what was called the wages of whiteness, which is the status that came from claiming your whiteness and differentiating yourself from blacks in particular, as well as from Mexican Americans. And so I think that is, those are the different steps through which the history of immigration society gets cut through by race and forgotten. As to how to build a multicultural society, I would say that the US is already a multicultural society, and so of course, you refer to questions of separation and discrimination and of course the permanence of racism. I tend to talk more about politics than about culture, so to give you a political response, I just think that what needs to be done is to so let me just give you an example. Preparing for this talk, I went back and I looked at Bernie Sanders' website and looked at his immigration proposal. And I contrasted because Trump and the Republican nominees in general had very clear nativist discourse on immigration. So what was the other side? And in particular, Clinton's response was to what I would call a humanitarian response. So you saw Clinton with children whose parents could be deported, and Clinton was there to protect them and promise them that they would do something. They would pass regularization. Now, Bernie Sanders was saying, well, what we need is access of immigrants to the Affordable Care Act, from which they were excluded. We need what he called whistleblower visas for workers who report abuse. So labor exploitation is a crucial way in which immigrants are discriminated against. And so he proposed that when there's exploitation, those immigrants should be protected. He proposed parole for deportees, so deportees to come back and be with the families. And so, this is not to say, oh, we should have welfare. This is just to distinguish how this was a political response rather than a humanitarian response to nature. So the political response thought about access to social services, thought about labor exploitation, and thought about the past, the unjust deportations that were just in that graph. And so I think that those measures, which are all egalitarian measures, would go a long way to recognizing the need for representation, rather than partitioning forms of services and rights according to race or status.
Thanks. Yeah, so I didn't say too much in detail about what kind of justifications of. So I think it includes both procedural elements and more substantive elements. One way to see that, so on the procedural side, say, right to a hearing, and I think that those elements can't easily be divorced from caring about there being actually good reasons behind the policy. So let's think about why you want the procedural stuff in the first place. So one reason is that you care about the procedural stuff because you want there to just be some check that there actually are good reasons behind the policy. Another reason you might care about the procedural stuff is that you want the person who is regulated to have some voice. It's inherently good to show them respect in that way. But there too, then you think, well, okay, if we care about them having a voice, surely we have to also care somewhat at least about their interests, and be some interest in participation of some kind. So something that kind of comes with a package to some degree.
One of not being political, I think one of the reasons that people forget simply about our immigration history and their own immigration status or immigrant status is that sometimes a figment of our two-party system. Like you're an insider or you're an outsider, right? And when you become an insider, if you were the last group to become an insider, you're the most fragile in that insider status, right? So you need to be the most vehement about creating that division between insiders and outsiders, and to say, I'm in, but you guys aren't. And so I think that's where some of that stems from, is the need to fit into a two-party system where there's only inside and outside.
Great, this was a great conversation. I wanted to reframe the conversation, because when we talk about immigration within the US Academy, we talk about it in two ways, right? We talk about it in US immigration as if something that is happening in the US is something exceptional, so we recreate American exceptionalism. We forget that immigration is a global phenomenon, and that 75% of displaced people don't come to the global West. They move within countries of origins or move within Africa or Asia. So I wanted to reframe that, and I really wanted to push back on all three of you to think about global inequality and the ethics or the unethics of global inequality that is connected with movement and connected with economic flows, or where are the trade blocks, where can people move or cannot move, and that very few people actually come to the United States. So by framing this conversation around national identity, national culture, the tension on the other side, we give so much agency to the other side. Not many people get to come to the US. And actually, if we look at 2012 census data, there is been a drop in US immigration because of deportation, because of return migration, because of 2008's drop, of the economy. There has 2012, people at census are very clear that actually people are moving back. There's outflows of immigration. There's a drop in internal immigration. So I feel like reframing the conversation within the academy around immigration at a global, thinking about the global scale or thinking about the changing trends is helpful in not giving agency to the other side, the nativist people, right? Because it's morally false, it's statistically false. So I wanted to hear about how to rethink immigration, in these broader frames that doesn't just hover around this conversation around the tension between sovereignty and national law, but actually rethink immigration to these pretty accidental frames. That there's a whole kinds of contingencies happening around global migration, around immigration to the US, and not give so much agency to this fear and tension. How can you reframe that?
Thank you. Yeah, I basically take your I didn't talk about the global aspects today, but I certainly agree that it's important, and I do think that there are various ways in which a focus just on migration to the West or other parts of the West distorts the debate somewhat. And so an example of that, I think, is certainly when we think about refugees, we forget that the vast majority of refugees are not coming to the United States or Germany, but are moving within the global South. And so that changes the debate. Then you have to ask, okay, well, does that mean we should provide persistence in these countries, or it's not just a question of how many people are going to come to the United States enough. I mean, I think it's not wild that people spend a fair amount of time asking about U.S. policy because that's the thing they get to vote on. But I totally agree with you that within the academy we ought to have a much broader conversation about migration, including within the global South and also internal displacement as well. So,
thank you very much. I agree, I mean, in fact, that's what I perhaps didn't devote most of my so that I try to note that immigration is interesting precisely because of what it's hiding, what it's covering up, and the global problems of all kinds, not only those coming to the West and making us all very anxious. Are in the background, and in particular the way in which people movements follow not only from conflict but from transnational factors in commodity chains, a lot of internal migration, of course, accommodating export protections, export zones, etc. And that's also why I think thinking about transformations in Mexico after the transformations in Central America, particularly after the one that Colombia moved the drug trade to the north, all of these are really central pieces for understanding not only the flows that are coming, but everything that is going on before that. And I really love on that conversation.
The focus, I think, for me on immigration restrictions by Western countries is in part driven by the fact that it is the restrictions by Western countries that are by far the largest impediments to production. By reducing our restrictions and those other countries in the West have the largest impact. And if the barriers to migration that exist within countries and within the global South are much smaller in terms of magnitude, they're very real. I mean, in the global magnitude, much smaller. But in some sense, they're also hard to figure out. It's hard to understand why people are moving or are not moving, what is inhibiting them, encouraging those who require a lot more careful analysis than being able to write an executive order.
So thank you very much. I just wondered to what extent you think it's going to be important in addressing immigration issues to deal with like the kind of quality of life issues that Jason was talking about, where so much of the support for the America First and the anti-immigration sentiment, including my friends and relatives in Southern Ohio, love Trump, they love the immigration ban, and in some, there's plenty of racism and xenophobia, but my sense of most of it doesn't run that deep. It's not, I brought my sister-in-law from Peru to visit my cousins in Athens County. I think it'd be gracious. I just don't think there would be an issue for them. Rather what's going on is a sense that when they say America First is what happened to us, and maybe there's an inflated or unjustified sense of entitlement that this country is supposed to be about white guys like me, but still you do have, once upon a time there was a political party that was considered a party of the working person. There's not really any political party that can call themselves that now. So that if there's something that can be done to deal with those quality of life issues, so that these guys felt like the system was working for them, then maybe they wouldn't care so much about immigration, they'd actually be fine. That's actually my sense of a lot of people that I know in those areas.
I agree with your assessment, and that was in a way precisely what I was trying to put forward, is the idea that immigrants are not the source of their grievances. Immigrants have remained the source of their grievances symbolically, and here is where the spectrum of discussion about immigration is terribly narrow in American politics. And it's terribly narrow for a reason, because there are a series of structural changes that have to do with the power of financial capital, the transformation of the economy from an industrial economy into a technology economy, and at the same time, again, at the same time, there's a retrenchment of the state. So while all of these economic transformations have no direction of what is going to become and the families. And so, I mean, I would be all for having that conversation. And here is where you get to the point that the debate is narrow not only because of the nativism of Republicans, but also the inability of the Democrats to respond with, serious reforms that would increase taxes, increase redistribution, curtail powers, the power of corporations in different ways that affect consumers and developers. How to make that happen? It's hard to say. I mean, we can wait and see what happens with democratic leadership and how the midterm elections are going to look like. But without these conversations, it's just very easy to maintain immigration as a boogeyman that is to make life.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with all that about underlying causes. I do think, I guess, when it comes to some of the proximate causes of the travel ban, though, it just does seem to me that, racism is a complicated term. Sometimes people use that to mean, outright animus, like, I don't want to, I would hurt this person if I saw them in the street. We do have some of that going around. We do have some threats to synagogues and mosques and so on. But we also have among people who are not harboring that kind of animus, just I think an irrationally broad fear of people from Muslim countries that is that does fit in the category of, I think, of these motivations for policies that are ruled out. Just as, for instance, people who wanted to prevent mentally ill folks living in their neighborhood, not because they hated them or because maybe they had a cousin or a friend who was, but just because they just had a kind of sense of uneasiness that was irrationally broad and not connected to the facts. And so I think that morally counts as something that is problematic, even if we're talking about. Look, my own uncle, just in Florida. My father's a Muslim. I grew up as a Muslim. He's still, it's not like he wouldn't call either of us like it, but he's a Trump supporter. And he's still, it's partly because he does just have some sense that, there's something going on over there and among these folks that's, I've met some of them and I like them, but it's like, we need to look into this. It's not quite, something's not right. And so people are complicated, I accept that, but I do think that gross stereotyping of whole groups is the kind of inegalitarian motivation that all of you ruled out as a motivation for policy.
Just following up on that, I think in my observation, people tend to not be prejudiced in the specifics, but in generalities, right? So when I come across somebody on the street, right, who's my neighbor or who my neighbor knows, they seem legitimate, I don't have a problem with them, and I can conclude safely that I'm not a racist, right? That I'm not prejudiced. But then, in general terms, it becomes much more problematic, right? And that's why I think a lot of this targeting and victimization and scapegoating comes in and is so detrimental. But in terms of allocating, in terms of helping native workers who might be hurt by immigration policy, this was actually something proposed by a previous speaker at the COMPAS event, who noted that there's nothing that says that the gains to immigration necessarily have to accrue only to the immigrant. That's the way we set it up currently. Right? Immigrant here, you retain your wages, you pay taxes, and then you keep it just like any other, just like you're a citizen. But in fact, nothing requires that, right? And if we were, so it raises a lot of interesting questions, right? Because ethically and morally, it seems wrong to say that we would tax immigrants differently than we would tax citizens. But then on the flip side, if a different taxation policy would allow more immigration, is that morally preferred to the case where we don't have different taxation structures, but we also don't have as much immigration? And then there was this question about permanent and temporary immigrants as well, and is it acceptable to have this class of temporary immigrants who never obtain, sort of legitimate status or, commensurate status in the U.S.
And I had going back to the idea of the narrative and symbolic things, I was thinking the Statue of Liberty was mentioned, how the Bible says, give me your wretched refuge. Well, does that mean like my grandma and her mother, if they could have read English, they'd say, oh, are you wretched refuse? You need to be free, and how do you not become that? And then I was thinking of the rags to riches, Horatio Alger. I always read it as like an immigrant narrative. It could have been Berlin on the Lower East Side, the man's patriot, So, are those symbols that could be used in some ways to construct a positive immigrant identity? My grandma always said, don't talk Jewish. The sisters, you don't want to be mean. She says, you don't want to be a green one. You need to assimilate, become an American. Is that outdated thinking? In some ways, it's offensive to call people wretched refugees. Who would that appeal to? Appeal to people who are so afraid, immigrants, to say, be patriotic. Look at what it says on the Statue of Liberty. I just wanted to get a spin on that. Maybe it was a form of colonialism, just anybody on our shores has to give up their national identity. So what is your view of that kind of symbolism?
I'm always surprised when the inscription in the Statue of Liberty is cited as like, look at this great thing that we put there, when of course it has some completely problematic undertones, and not really not really that much value under anything. So you mentioned, I'm not sure where you were referring in particular to the rags to riches, or to later you mentioned one question of assimilation, but when it comes to the rag to riches, I think that that is a problematic narrative in the sense that it's just an extension of this work ethic narrative that holds in the US. And again, that is problematic because, marks everyone else that hasn't made it as individually the problem. His or her inability to work hard is what is at stake. In fact, this is a very prominent narrative, and when Ronald Reagan made Ellis Island into a museum, he actually named as his director Lee Jacoba, who was the son of Polish immigrants and who became the head of, I don't forget which car company, and so putting a CEO as the director of a public-private partnership that establishes institutional migration is exactly that. It's like everyone can make it to a CEO, to the top. And in terms of assimilation, trying not to look sound, not to look that's of course a very understandable impulse. But that is also the result of the fact that everything that is not quote-unquote American, which again is a very classic concept, is devalued by definition. So again, it is kind of not addressing the problem, but trying to fit in, and going back to Du Bois's critique of Americanization, like why instead of going this way and trying to look as white as possible, we contest the power of what is kind of value.
But I think the rags to riches story is an interesting one too, where the discussion about immigration walks this very fine line between arguing at times that all immigrants can be successful, right? Like how many immigrants are responsible for tech startups and all the creation of all these jobs and how much they contributed to the American economy versus, acknowledging this other subset of immigrants that works, that works so hard and but isn't at that level. And so I don't know how we put those two narratives together to create an image of immigrants that's, I don't know, constructive, I guess, for our political discussion. And which one we should favor. Is it detrimental when we, hold up people like Ines as the premier example of an immigrant, detrimental to our vision of immigrants?
I do think so. I think that politically more useful ways of thinking about contribution to immigrants is the way in which, for instance, you could think about the 2006 demonstrations. There was a law that proposed to criminalize undocumented status. So by being undocumented, you would automatically be a criminal as opposed to a civil violator, which is what you are right now. And so millions of immigrants came out in major cities in the U.S. against that law, which ended up not being passed. But this, much has been written about this, these marches, and I'm particularly thinking of Cristina Beltran's 2009 piece and then her book, The Trouble with Unity. And what she said, what was really valuable about these marches was to show, how there was the subject that was at the same time vulnerable and supposedly living in the shadows, quote unquote, and coming out and saying, well, I'm a legal subject, I have rights, and today I'm marching, tomorrow I'm voting, and no criminalization is acceptable. So this assertion of a political status of a subject that had none, and also I go back to what Adam said about slaves and Native Americans not being considered. So these moments in which, or women, in which subjects that are not considered citizens assert their citizenship in even more stronger terms than citizens, I think that is what we should get from immigrants, the possibility of us changing common sense of who is in and who is out. So putting those boundaries of inside and outside that we were referring to in the question. I think that's what would be most valuable. From the perspective of the democratic leaders, that's what's most valuable.
I was wondering whether actually both of you can say more about Ines, you just started this, on the effect of migrant-based social movements in fostering norm shift. Thinking of the No One Is Illegal movement, which some theorists and philosophers have written a little bit about. Tom Stan's book here. How important are those kinds of movements in the popular backlash that we saw against the ban? Are they separate conversations that it has no effect on I know it has an effect in European politics, but in terms of the US context, how important are these feelings of legal demonstrations and the social movements in creating kind of cascading norm, to use the term in the science term, cascading norm shift among migrants?
That is a great question, and I think to some extent these are separate conversations in the sense that there are pro-immigrant arguments in the public here, in the public debate on immigration, but I don't think that they are the more radical or progressive pro-immigrant arguments. And so, by this I refer mostly in mainstream immigrant rights organizations, that what they put forward is the benefits. These are the benefits of immigration. This is why we should let them in, because they work hard, they do jobs that nobody else does, and they are family, and they have strong family values. And and this to some extent has been the rhetoric in the on the Obama administration as well as in the Clinton campaign. And there is a more marginal set of groups, and this I borrow from Alfonso Gonzalez's work on Reform Without Justice, his book. And among these groups that are more marginal are immigrant-based, and are people that couldn't question the system of enforcement itself. And so, in particular, no one is legal, I don't know if that's prominent in the US, but undocumented immigrants, they come out with this undocumented and afraid. So I'm undocumented and I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness. I'm unafraid and I'm going to put in question this massive system of detention and deportation. And I'm going to put in question so there were these young immigrants that had qualified for DACA, which is deferred for deportation status. So they're young. They came here as children, so they qualified. And so these two young women and a young man, they actually turned into the police, knowing that they were protected, and they infiltrated a Florida detention center. And what they did was basically, eventually they were released because they were not deported. But what they basically did was publicize the many people without criminal background, and even people that would have been eligible for DACA, which is this program of deferral deportation for young people, that were in prison. So they were basically going against this idea like, we are only deporting those who are criminals, we are only deporting those who are well. And so I think there is that going on. I mean, there is a lot of that going on now with sanctuary cities and reactions to Trump's executive orders. I mean, its currency is not as as broad as one would hope. But again, you depend on politicians being advocates of it and bringing this in. So yeah.
Can I observe that do you think the state has any legitimacy in enforcing the state immigration law? We do have restrictions, and there are legal speaker. I'm sorry, I was just asking if our panelists think that the state has any legitimacy in enforcing immigration law. If we think that if the law is unjust or whatever, is there legitimacy in enforcing it, and then what should we do at this point?
I think that the laws as they are today are not legitimate, and this is because the political economy of the United States relies on immigrant labor. So about 60% of agricultural workers are undocumented workers, and even more are immigrant workers. And this has been the case throughout. And here I'm borrowing from Nicholas General's work on the production of illegality. And so, I mean, if you have an economy that relies on a particular form of labor, and throughout the 20th century, you gradually limit more and more the ability of this labor, which you rely on, and perfectly well know that you rely on, you limit their capability of being regular, then for that reason, I believe that it is the construction of this quote-unquote illegal alien or even criminal alien that supports these laws, and I do not consider them. In addition, without getting into the harm and the forms of domination that result from these laws, just based on the idea we have a certain political economy that relies on a certain form of labor, and you legally curtail the capacity of that labor to be legal. So for that reason,
so our moral duty is to our own perceptions of legitimacy and justice versus what actually is or what's the stated law. Is that correct?
right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not an open borders person. I do think that there can be some legitimate immigration restrictions, but I think they are subject to, when it comes to exclusion, they're subject to this requirement of being able to offer some kind of justification to those excluded. And then when it comes to deportation, I think the principles that I talked about have an even stronger bite, because when you have folks who've been here for 10, 20 years, their whole life, the principle that says you have to justify yourself to people over whom you're exercising control, the state's exercises enormous control over those folks for a large period of their life. And so the argument, I have to prefer or defend amnesties and roughly that ground, at least for people who've been here for a reasonable period of time.
Yeah, I would just on whether we should have any immigration restrictions at all. I would just say, from an economic perspective, in terms of trade, you hear Congress arguing always for free trade, right, and trade liberalization, and not as frequently for complete liberalization of immigration. And I think the distinction is because because if they went to move, it is because a buyer and a market has been identified. Right? Somebody is taking ownership of the goods as they move across the border. If we remove all immigration restrictions, there isn't necessarily an employer who is taking ownership of the worker as they move across the border. And it's unknown what the magnitude of those flows would be for people who haven't identified employers yet. But that's always, I think, a concern lurking underneath this idea of removing all immigration restrictions, right? Is that just like we see people moving to New York or LA, right, or new undergrads moving to New York or LA because they hope that they can get a job, right? Some of them do, some of them don't, right? So it's just one decision and between workers and goods.
Thank you. So I think this question will combine a couple of things. So one question I always struggle with is, in a lot of these debates, who is an immigrant? And I'm just wondering how you define it, because, and how that then actually, depending on how you define it, affects the question of who counts as part of the American nation. So, an immigrant can be somebody who has come from another country, right? They're born in another country, they migrate and then they're accepted. But it seems to me that sometimes the immigrant group is defined as just some group that has come more recently than some other. So even if, for example, my children were born, say, in Canada, the fact that they're ethnically Chinese, might make them still immigrants to some people, right, with certain consent. So what I'm wondering there is about how much the rights of outsiders are in a way deeply connected to racialized accounts of the insider. And how, in a way, like, Adam, you focus very much on sort of the outsiders, people who don't have status or who are not in the territory. But then I think, well, to the extent that their rights are sort of not validated, what happens when they do become American citizens? Like, is Ines saying, well, actually, there's still the racialization going on, and so in fact, even when they're insiders, they're still seen as kind of not equal in status. Is that really true of American national identity? I don't know enough to be able to say it.
Right. I think that is true, and it's not just American identity, but if you look at the literature on immigration and sociology, like first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants, and I'm like, do they never stop being immigrants? So, even so this question of populations of immigrant descent, to what extent did they remain immigrants forever? And I think that there is that, and I also think that given that this party has to do with race, there is great continuity between what you've seen developing as features of the immigration reporting system since the mid-1990s and what you have seen in terms of criminal justice. This was a terrible decade because the decade in the welfare bill was passed, the crime bill was passed, 2 immigration and anti-terrorism bills were passed, and so the growth in mass incarceration is parallel to the growth in immigrant detention, although immigrant detention starts later after 9/11. And so I tend to see lots of continuity between racialized forms of surveillance and confinement in vis-a-vis domestic and vis-a-vis citizens, racialized citizens, and immigrants. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't focus on this, but I certainly, I'm not an expert on the empirics, but it does seem to me there's a dynamic where the treatment of what you express to outsiders has an effect on what you express to insiders. So if you demonize Mexican immigrants who want to cross the border, then that also says something to Mexican Americans. And so that actually, I think, has been a little bit more recognized in the philosophical literature. So today, as part of why today I focused on something else, which was people generally said, well, if you're going to complain about the treatment of Muslims who want to come in, you have to find some way of saying how that affects Muslims who are here. But I don't think that's true. I think there are also rights on the part of people who are outside of the territory too. So that's sort of why I wanted to emphasize it. But I definitely think there is there is also this problem that the way you relate to outsiders affects how the relationship to the state is.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time.
So thank you. I welcome people back then for, it'll be on trade and labor. And also, our team wanted to put up this photo that we used for the immigration COMPAS conversation a few years ago, which in the American context anyway, juxtaposes this old political cartoon with these words from the base of the Statue of Liberty. So anyway, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you.
Thank you for inviting me. I didn't know you guys did this.
See you this afternoon.